Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar. This is the fourth in the series of webinars that we've been hosting for the past couple of months, all on the theme of rivers. We had a webinar about the Ken River, about the Godavari, about the Betwa, and this is the fourth, which is about the Ganga. About the Ganga through the lens of our project at Veditum, which is called Moving Upstream. So I'll want to introduce you to the project very quickly and then move to the stories themselves. Moving Upstream at Veditum is a project, a long-term project where we want to document India's rivers intimately, which is why we've been walking in detail and temporally. We want to keep doing it again and again. So for example, we walked along the Ganga in 2016 and 17. So we hope to repeat that exercise again soon. And in order to do this, in order to document our rivers, through the Moving Upstream project, we've also instituted a fellowship called the Moving Upstream Fellowship, along with Out of Eden Walk, where we've invited young people from India to walk along rivers. And as part of our fellowship, we had about 10 people in the last 1 year walk along River Betwa and document it. That documentation is now available on our website to be seen. And I urge you to go and look at it to see how so many different lenses have been able to look at this landscape, to look at our riverscapes and document them so vividly. Coming back to today's webinar, walking along River Ganga, I personally spent more than 6 months along the river walking. And like I said earlier, it's just very difficult to talk about the entire river together. Not in this 1.5 hours of a webinar, and not in the 1.5 hours of documentary that we've made based on this walk that we had undertaken. So I'll still attempt to introduce you to the idea. And after about 10 minutes, I'll hand over the screen to friends who had and companions who had joined the walk while I was walking along the river, as support, as exploration, as part of the team to further improve this documentation process. And I'll introduce you to them as we move to them. But just mentioning their names, Ankit Batheja, who's on the call, joined me from Banaras to Allahabad. Then Shridhar and Nupur both joined me on the walk from Bijnor Barrage all the way till Gangotri. And Alisha joined me on the walk from Kodiala in Uttarakhand all the way till Gangotri. Everybody spent different amounts of time walking, but eventually you'll hear their stories and see how rich it was. Quickly moving to the next slide. Just to give you an idea, I know most people know about the Ganga in India, but for those who are not aware or those who've joined us from outside India, this is a rough map of the river Ganga in India. It flows from Gangotri, which is in the Himalayas, and flows through the mountains, through the floodplains, and eventually meets the ocean at Bay of Bengal. And that's where we started our walk from. That's the starting point, as you can see. We moved upstream along the river. We had an initial team of people walking with us and documenting the walk, who dropped out just about when we moved from Bengal to Jharkhand. And later on, Ankit joined the walk and stayed with me for a week. And then the walk continued. I got injured. The walk paused for a bit. And when we restarted, then Shridhar and Nupur joined the walk. A few days later, then Alisha also joined the walk. And then this whole process took us about 6 months from the starting to the end point, with a substantial break in the middle because of an injury. This is something that I wanted to show to you in the beginning so that you think about it by the time we reach the discussion about dams and barrages on the river, which will also be very tiny. I'll just introduce you to the concept because this concept itself deserves its own webinar. These are all the dams and barrages just on the main stem of the River Ganga. There are hundreds of dams on the tributaries of the river. And that definition of the river between the main stem and the tributary, or the main stem, which is called the Ganga, and the other tributaries that contribute to make that river, is a very interesting conversation, and we can talk about that later. This is where we started, the ocean, at a place called Ganga Sagar, Sagar Island, which is in West Bengal. And then we moved upstream. This is where the river meets the sea. And over the years, like I just mentioned about barrages, since the time the Farakka barrage has been built, the amount of silt that the river carries to the ocean has reduced drastically. And that effect is felt very starkly to the people who live in these areas. And I'll tell you more about that. But this daily walking gave us an insight, made us uh, participants almost in the lives of people, but very ephemerally, very in a very short duration. And all the credit is to people for allowing us to get into their lives and looking at their lives and sharing their lives with us. The first uh, sort of question that is asked often is, what is it exactly that you were doing while walking? And I think this sort of small list defines that, even though it was more expansive. But people's relationship with the river, rainfall, lives of fishing communities, agriculture, groundwater, I think these are all very important topics to deal with. And we try to document a lot of these. I will only show you a few of these today in the slides. And when we do release our documentary and we release further stories from our walk, then you will be able to make the connections. The first stretch of the walk that we had undertaken was in Bengal. And I'll talk a bit more about Bengal because the rest of the panelists had joined the walk later, so they'll talk more about Uttar Pradesh or Uttarakhand. The Farakka barrage that I just mentioned, it's completely changed the nature of the river in these areas. And what it has meant is the river that for some people was a seasonal river, which had an ebb and a flow, which transitioned between seasons, had now become a river that was present all the time. And what that meant, what this um, constant presence of the river meant, was that it was eating more and more land. And that is something that has not been discussed as much. We hope to discuss this more, and we'll take up questions if you have about this topic. I'm just really touching upon some topics that we had encountered. Vanishing fish and interventions like barrages, which are not scientific in nature, have multifold effect. And along with land, fish are also vanishing. This vary from all kinds of fish, like the very popular hilsa, which is known to be a delicacy in Bengal. At times was found 1500 kilometers upstream from the point where the river meets the sea, all the way in Allahabad. And this fish is now not available in the same quantities because of overfishing, but also because of anthropogenic interventions, large scale interventions like the dams and barrages. And what you see here in the picture is women counting small fish fry, which are called mocha chingri in West Bengal, in Bengali. And each of these fish fry is sold for a rupee or two. But if you talk to them, of course, the number of people who are doing fishing has increased. But at the same time, uh, the volume of fishes, even if you combine all the fishermen, has drastically reduced. And of course, this has lots of different factors. It's not a direct interplay between population numbers and just dams and barrages. But I think that's again a larger discussion. Power. Um, this is an intricately linked story with the story of water in India. What you see on the screen on the right side are the chimneys of the Farakka super thermal power plant. What you see in front, the water, is actually a canal where the water from the Farakka barrage is diverted, and this canal and the river downstream from this point are used as a waterway. And there's a huge push now for waterways to supply coal to these thermal power plants. Um, this very water that you're seeing at this point often sees extreme temperature fluctuations because the power plant, which is not supposed to release hot water or water containing oil, does it often. And that hurts the fishermen, the fishing communities, because it hurts their catch. But what it also hurts is dolphins. This place does have dolphins, the Gangetic dolphin. It's India's national aquatic animal. And when I talk about the dolphin here, which is downstream of the Farakka barrage, if you move along the river further up, we come to Bihar, where there is a dolphin sanctuary, which is about 100 kilometers long. There's plenty of dolphins here. The kind of vegetation, the kind of geomorphology of the river, the uh, conditions here are very conducive to having dolphins. But again, they are threatened by this same idea of making our rivers into canals and making our rivers into waterways. And that's something that really needs to be discussed. I can take this question up in Q&A. I won't take much time now. And from dolphins, which is the Gangetic dolphin, which is a native species, the national aquatic animal of India, to exotic fish, because of so many interventions, because of the way we've treated our rivers, we don't have enough native fish anymore. And corporations locally end up putting seeds of foreign fish into the rivers so that the local fishermen can survive. And this is an issue that is seen not just in this river, it's seen in other rivers also. I just want to point out that it's not a very straightforward discussion about exotic fish. But what's key is the fact that when you put exotic and non-native species into the river, what it also does is it eats up the space, literally, for which is meant for the native species. So we're on very thin ice when we're talking about the kind of ecological changes that we're making to our rivers. And often we talk about ecological changes only in terms of biodiversity or fish or animals, but there's more to it. And in this country, the Ganga particularly is prayed to. There's so much devotion. People, even today, I read some news articles about people's religious sentiments being hurt, and all of them talk about praying to a river. But what is this river? Where is this god? Where is this goddess? And because of the walking, because of the time I spent walking along the river, meeting people who understand this river, meeting experts who explain this to me, what became clear was our rivers aren't just in the channels that we see or the pipelines that we generally understand as rivers. Our rivers are under the ground. Our rivers are in floodplains. And what's happened today is that we're extracting extreme amounts of water from this reservoir of groundwater, which actually feeds our rivers. We are diverting this water through canals for irrigation purposes. Again, we need to think about these things. We need to discuss more. But again, as I said, it's a very wide topic. So I'm just touching upon it lightly here. This goddess that we talk about, this goddess which we have so much devotion to, this goddess towards which we have an entire ministry dedicated right now, which has programs such as Aviral Dhara and Nirmal Dhara present in the ministry's rule books or guidelines. This is a picture from 2017. This is roughly end of March in 2017. And I don't see any dhara, and Aviral Dhara and Nirmal Dhara basically mean clean and unfettered flow in the river, unobstructed flow in the river. and there is no flow in the river at all to be called Agrawal or Nirmal either. So I think with devotion or with the idea of governance or with the idea of fancy names in programs, I think we really need to think about what really is the reality. And if we do want to understand this idea of rivers. And just one more example of the Tehri Dam. The it's a massive dam which is currently mostly being used to supply water to Delhi, and for which communities have been broken up, for which communities have been separated. People still have not been compensated as claimed by them. Health issues have arisen. So it's such a wide variety of things that have happened, and that's the real reality, where the water isn't flowing like you saw in the previous picture, and where the water is stagnant. Again, if you look at it from the lens of devotion or religion, according to religious stories or mythological stories, it is only in the power of a god to hold back the Ganga, which is why the concept of Shiv being part of the whole process of getting the mystical Ganga on earth came into being. But now we are playing God, so to say, by tying up that same river, which could not be controlled by anyone else but a God. Um, um, I'm going to quickly just wrap this up and say that all this walking, the 3,000 kilometers along the Ganga, the time spent has been very meditative for me. I've spent lots of time thinking about the things that people have shared with me about concepts about the river, and some of which I've tried to share here. Of course, it's just non-exhaustive. It's so much to be shared, but I want you to also walk, and I will let you be inspired by the stories and ideas that are shared by others following this. And with the river, with friends, this is how we were able to make the whole journey and document the river. Um, and yeah, moving upstream, I'll stop here. I've already taken more time than I was supposed to. And I'll ask Ankit to share next. Ankit, hi Ankit. Uh,
Yes,
Ankit
Siddharth.
joined the walk with me in Banaras and walked all the way till Allahabad. So I'll let Ankit speak about his experience. And Ankit, if you also want to introduce yourself, that would be nice.
Sure. Thank you, Siddharth. Um, Hello, everyone. As Siddharth already gave a glimpse of his larger journey of walking along the Ganga for 2,000 kilometers and for a much longer period. My joining him along was for a very short time. I walked probably 100 kilometers with him for a week. And before I get into details or some stories from my walking along the River Ganga with Siddharth, I would like to also tell that why this journey was important for me. And I mean, this the way I am starting is like starting with a conclusion. What I would conclude my journey in two lines as uh, yeah. Also, a bit of my introduction. So I'm currently working. I've done engineering and I've uh, done various stints in my career, and I have mainly worked in education, and I'm currently working in online education for workplace skills. That is what I'm currently doing. Getting to my journey, as I said, why this journey was important for me, or why I reached out to Siddharth that I want to join him for walking, was as a journey. I remember it before starting was one for my own exploration. Sorry, I'm changing slide. However, the way I am able to remember it now is one of exploring possibilities, more possibilities than one can think of. And that's what this walk is all about for me. That knowing that there is more to life and the world than we know. And what I would conclude saying that it's important that we know, and that can be done by going out by walking. So I had joined Siddharth for his walk from Varanasi till Allahabad. The time I had joined him was in August 2016, and it was a different time and probably a more stark experience for me to join the walk at that point, because all the areas around were flooded from Varanasi till Allahabad. I would talk of various themes by which I take from my walking experience of a week, and I would like to share some of the experiences based on those themes. One broad theme which stands out for me is dependence. So, how I understand dependence of exploring the ecosystem in which a different ecosystem than I had already lived. I had mainly lived in cities throughout my life, and we were walking along cities, towns, and villages. How I remember it as a realization. I would not say that I knew it completely of the dependence of farmers and fishermen on river, but I would say it came out as a realization that how much farmers and fishermen or the communities which live by the river depend on the river for sustainability, and how much it feeds into their life for the belief systems or the stories they live with. I remember the first day we had moved out of Banaras and stopped by a village on the walk. It was they were sharing stories, as Siddharth earlier mentioned, that how industries have affected the catch of fishermen. They were sharing that how different activities in Varanasi has over years affected their catch of fishes a lot. In as just to give as an example, how river lives as a important part of the people who live by the river. I remember from the same conversation on the first day, I remember a child, swinging with on the tire hanging by the tree. And just to give an idea, that stays with me as a photogenic memory of how much the river would be a great part of the childhood of those children. This understanding depend that nature and that nature and man, how much they are dependent on each other, or how much the communities living by depend on the river, came out more starkly. As I said earlier, that the most of the regions were flooded all around, and at times we had to change our ways. We had to cross bridges and walk on another roads while we were moving towards Allahabad. The Varanasi I knew before. It was full of tourists and ghats. Full of people, but the way we remember Varanasi ghats, there are a lot of steps, but all the steps were covered with water, and in several roads we were using boats to roam around. The theme of dependence also stayed for us as travelers, because while we were traveling along, uh, we depended on people and communities we came across. This is the day from the first day of me joining the walk of the dhaba where we spent our night. And while browsing, while picking out these features today, I realized that I don't even remember at what point had we asked them to let us stay there. In, as far as I can remember, I was completely tired and Siddharth was having conversations. And later I knew that we were staying there, and it was as natural as coming out of the conversations that we will be spending the night there. This is how much we depended on all on we for our travel. We mostly depended on the people we came across or the places we went to. Moving on from dependence, another broad major theme which stays with me is humility. At any point, we were always welcome for a conversation. And most of the times we walked through towns, there were people who noticed us, and they were always curious to know that why we are walking, what are we doing. We would often be seen as salesmen because we were carrying our backpacks, but when they started talking, they were much curious into knowing that why are we walking, why would we not take an auto simply to reach where we are trying to reach. And that was the point where we tried them to explain that we want to see more, listen more, understand more, and that's why we are walking. These are some photos of several points where we stopped by for a conversation, and of course people were always curious and excited to see us. We would always be offered water, and i mean I remember the times where people were people used to worry about us, that did we have had food, do we need water or something. It was there. And moving I mean continuing on this point of humility, what stayed with me, it's been years since I went for that walk. And what stayed with me is again the theme of dependence. I can remember because of humility of the people we came across, that how much living in cities we depend on villages, and not only for our daily needs, but also, I mean, how much villages support the crowded settlements we live in, and how much these villages balance the ecosystem, which cities don't contribute to. I mean, if there would have been all cities, I would only wonder how the ecosystem would have been. It is again, it is still a big imbalance, but I believe that villages are helping to balance or save the ecosystem. And there, I feel that it is the shared responsibility and should not only be on the villages or out town areas. The most exciting part of, as I'm telling several stories, the most exciting part for me was also listening to several stories or remembering several stories while we walked along the river. So I mean, one big part, one may could one exciting area or place I remember was Chunar, which falls in between Varanasi and Allahabad. And there's a big Chunar fort, which is a very interesting place for traveling to. I remember, I mean, it was it was like an unexplored area for me, to visiting that Chunar fort, to listening to several stories associated with Chunar fort, and knowing more about Chunar, the occupation of the place Chunar, and how the fort came up and the river alongside. This photo specifically tells about an incident where near Allahabad we took help of a fisherman for helping us to cross the river, one of the tributaries of Ganga. And more excitingly, while he helped us cross the river, he was narrating the incident where Bhagwan Ram took help of a fisherman to cross the river as while he was going towards Lanka. And that also, against, I had used this word before, but stays as a photogenic memory, that how much these belief systems, stories, and narratives live with people, and how much it supports and as an anchor for their daily life. And that was very interesting for me to observe how much mythological narratives, as I had said earlier, that belief system, these the river, staying by the river form their belief systems, and these mythological narratives are ones with which they live their daily life. And I would just conclude. I mean, I had shared some of the themes. I had shared my broad idea earlier only. I would conclude uh, with some gratitude for Siddharth, because I mean, it was his conviction only which made me walk. I was there for a week, but every day I would think that, oh, this happened, now I should stop walking and go back. But Siddharth's conviction helped me to continue, and I'm thankful. It was a great experience. That's all,
Thank
Siddharth.
you so much, Ankit. Any questions for Ankit, you can put it in the chat box. We'll answer it later on. Next, we have, who did we decide? Shridhar or Nupur? Shridhar, okay. Okay, any of you can start. I mean, it's
Nupur, you want to go first?
Nupur, your mic is on mute.
It's okay. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. Shridhar.
Cool.
Cool, okay. Right. So Sridhar, so we have also made a film based on the walk along the Ganga. We've not put it out yet. It's been a long time coming. I'll talk a little about that once we discuss the whole, once everyone has shared. And in the meanwhile, Sridhar is currently directing the film. He's really put all this information together. I just don't know how he's managed to do it. It's such a lot of information. Of course, it's not enough, but he joined me on the walk for the last 1.5 months from Bijnor all the way till Gangotri, where he was recording stories, I was recording stories. We're doing this whole exercise together. So Shira, do you want to take over? And
Yeah, I'll take over. Cool. So, hi everyone. My name is Shridhar, and we have so less time. I don't really want to get into any introductions. I just want to show you a very small piece of the documentary, and then we'll talk about the idea of walking. along the river
It's
Ganga.
a couple of minutes, I think, right?
Yeah, it's just 2 minutes.
Okay.
कैसा लग रहा है उत्तराखंड आके?
उत्तराखंड आके अभी तो धूप लग रही है फिलहाल तो।
और कितना आगे बाकी है?
हरिद्वार अभी 20-22 किलोमीटर और है। 11:30 बजे हैं अभी। पहुंच जाने चाहिए आज। काफी समय हो गया, एक माइलस्टोन था हरिद्वार दिमाग में। पहुंचना है, पहुंचना है, पहुंचना है। आज पहुंच जाएंगे। चल रहे हैं इस एम्बैंकमेंट के ऊपर, कोई छांव नहीं बिल्कुल भी। और धूप भी बहुत तेज है।
So that was just a short 2-minute piece of the sorry I'm so sorry. So this is a short piece of from the documentary. Why I wanted to show you this was essentially to understand what does it mean to actually walk on the banks of a river. There's a definite idea of pace that we do not understand when we stay in a city or when we are very accustomed to things moving fast. It's like what really hit me the most when I went on the walk was the idea of sitting still. So whenever you're in a city, or at least this happens to me, whenever you sit in a city, you sit with the knowledge that you will have to leave in some time. You sit with the idea of, okay, after an hour, 2 hours, whatever, but you'll have to move on because the city would not stop if you stopped. But when I went on the walk and when we are walking, and the act of walking is so meditative, it's just the same rhythm over and over and over. It gets you in a pace and a rhythm which makes you understand and which lets go of this entire anxiety of a certain kind that we have in at least in cities that I have felt, that you have to get somewhere. And this seed of thought actually is something that I have thought about a lot more since the walk, but was something very significant that I found within the walk itself. And that's why, for example, when we were sitting under whatever the bush that we had on the banks of the river while we were walking near when we were reaching Haridwar, I remember that we were sitting, we knew that we had to walk in some time, but there's no anxiety of like, oh, now we have to start walking again. It's truly a pause in the narrative rather than like, you wanting to start again. that it's a very subtle idea, and I don't know if I'm able to make it, if I'm able to articulate it that well, but that is something that really hit me when I was on the walk. And that is something that I've tried to interpret in some way or the other in the film that we have made. The second thing that really hit me was conditioning. Because when you are at least urban educated like I am, you realize that a lot of value, we the idea of exchange we consider in terms of money, like the idea of monetary value of any object is the only value that we can associate. We have been conditioned to think of it in a certain way. I want to show you just one small piece about this guy. So I'll just put the video on. And so this guy has a very small sugarcane um, juice making shop. This is about 5-8 kilometers from Tehri Dam. So this was the first day that we left Tehri Dam and we met him. And he offered us sugarcane juice at that place for $30 a glass. And we asked him, okay, that's a little ridiculous because $30 a glass, where do you get your sugarcane from? He said, Haridwar. I said, okay, if it is from Haridwar, 100 kilometers away, so where is the profit? Like, how do you afford giving it at $30 a glass? And he just said that it's hot, this is sugarcane juice, it will make you feel nice. And that's the only thing I care about. I care about you feeling nice, and not about how much profit I'll make out of feeding you that sugarcane juice. And that is huge for me, because the reality of this guy is that the place where he has his shop, his actual house was about 500 meters downhill from that point, which is now completely underwater. So when Tehri was made, 134 villages were submerged in water, and his house was one of those villages. And for the next 20 odd years, he fought for that small piece of land so that he can re-establish himself. And so finally, when he got that piece of land, after fighting for so long, he in the interview he says that, oh, now so my kids are also grown up and now I can't leave. And everybody those 134 villages, we don't know about their stories. Like in the cities, we do not understand where our water comes from, where is the resource that we are using coming from. It's very important that we do not think about this entire idea of uh, when we switch on a tap, or when we switch on a shower, or when we do all of these things that we do on a regular basis in a city, are we taking away from somebody else their resource, which is rightfully theirs, which they have been over generations maintaining and conserving, and taking it for ourselves? For example, a lot of rivers for example, Ganga has been dammed, and a canal 500-kilometer long gets water from Ganga to Delhi. The same way for Bombay, a lot of rivers in Maharashtra have been dammed to get water to Bombay. So a lot of these cities thrive out of uh, resources that we have taken away from people who have been taking care of these resources. And in the education system that we now have, we don't have a space for educating ourselves into understanding where this resource is coming from and how do we conserve this resource so that we can still use it, or future generations can still use it. And that is a huge gap that I found personally in my understanding of the world itself, that I never thought about. Okay, there is a certain idea of in science class you're learning about conservation of energy, of renewable resources, but you never think about it or never have a practical idea of how do you enforce it or practice it within your life, which is something that people who live along the river, especially in smaller cities and rural areas, it is a part of their daily lives, which is a huge huge learning that I had, especially on the walk. The third thing, and I don't want to take a lot of time here, is simply the idea of how we do not really understand India. Like, at least when I went on the walk, I realized how big a gap I have in my own head of my perception of my fellow countrymen. I'll give you an example. We were in Sukki Top, which is a small village, I think about 20-30 kilometers from Gangotri. And at Sukki Top, it was Ashtami. So Durga Puja is going on, and it was Ashtami when we reached. And that night they had a puja. And in the middle of the puja, 4 women had what we say, Mata chad jati hai. Like they had, like they were, I don't know what you say it in English. Like they were taken over by
Spirited.
spirits. Spirited, yeah, not just spirit, like taken over by spirits, right? And for us, it was a huge thing. Matlab, for me, it was something that we haven't seen a lot. But for everybody else in the village, it was just another Tuesday. Like, for example, that is okay, that is an extreme example, but smaller things like knowing all the names of the trees that we carry, that we came across, what they are used for, what where does the water come from, where does it go, what will happen if small changes will happen into the ecosystem. For example, this again Sukki Top only, they had a story, like basically generations before them had told them that there was a huge earthquake that happened in that area 200 years ago, and the entire mountainside had fallen, and that had created a huge lake. And then over the next 200 years, the river kind of made its way, and now you can't see the lake because the lake doesn't exist, but you can still see that flat land that the lake had. Now all of this is indigenous knowledge that people who come for surveys, people who come for policy making, completely disregard, simply because they think that people who are not educated in the system that we are educated in do not know as much as we know, which is a huge gap in our understanding of our world. For example, this entire idea of being urban educated and thinking that there is a hierarchy between what we know and what people who are not educated or the illiterate know, is, I was made more aware of how wrong this preconception is, and how arrogant this perspective is. And that is something that hit me the hardest. So these are the things that I really wanted to share with you on such a small talk. And hopefully when the documentary comes out, it deals with this in a little more detail that you can do in like 1 hour 40 minutes. Yeah, now over to Nupur.
Thank you. Little bit short of time, so I'm gonna ask Nupur to share her stories.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I hope our participants don't mind, our viewers don't mind. Nupur, over to you. Nupur joined the walk along with Shridhar at Bijnor when we had started, and then walked with me all the way to Gangotri. And just a small break, she took some work for some work. But I think she's got a very interesting perspective. She's also written a very interesting piece for us on Veditum's website. Post the webinar, I will be sharing a document with all these stories that you can read. So yeah, over to you, Nupur. Your mic is on mute.
So sorry. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Nupur, and I actually knew Siddharth from college. I knew of his work, and it was quite inspiring for all of us what he was doing. And before this walk, he did some cycling project, and I used to always think that if I could join, but I was always discouraged. Usually, women are not thought to have that physical capability, so it seemed like a big thing. And when I got this opportunity to join the walk, it changed lot of these stereotypes in mind. Like it gave a lot of physical boost to me. And at that point, especially, it was a very interesting point when I joined the walk, because I had quit my job. I was exploring what I like, what I don't like. And as Shridhar mentioned, I also wanted to go away from city life and take a pause or slow down, and not be anxious about what I need to do next. Just be. So I'm going to share some of the photos, which would also give you a peek into how our day was, what our day consisted of, and also behind the scenes of making this film. So yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So we were walking, of course.
You have to share your screen from the green button on the menu from Zoom.
Okay, I didn't. So sorry. Mm, 1 second. Yeah.
Okay.
Visible now? Okay. So I'll just give a peek into what our day consisted of. What was the walk like? Sorry, I'm not able to go to the next slide.
Go to full screen, click on the slide once, and
You
then
can see now?
yeah.
Great. So yeah, we used to. I started my journey from plains in Uttar Pradesh to mountains till Gangotri. So it was very different in terms of also the people we met. Like I remember one thing. I remember one incident where some people started speaking to us in English, and they thought we were Westerners. We've come from London, and it was it was such a surprise to just tell them, or even like get introduced to this whole idea of how not many Indians from cities visit this area. So incidents like those. Here Siddharth would collect data. The river, we used to take some difficult Sridhar taking some difficult shots. Us interacting with local people, shooting with them. We used to often get invited to places like these, have discussions. Um, we used to take just rest anywhere we find space. And yeah, finally reached Gangotri. So I'll tell you one more incident that stayed with me, that made me realize a lot of things. So there was this tea stall owner we met, and he started saying that, I am 8th class fail and I don't know much about the dam. So there was this Tehri dam built near his village. So he said, I'm 8th class fail, I don't know much about this dam, but then people who built it are the intelligent ones, are the educated ones. So they would definitely know what is the right thing to do and what is not. So this whole incident just left me with this question of how these ideas are formed, or how the system convinces them into believing that they know less than people in the cities, or they less than the people who are actually educated. So yeah, and at the end, this whole walk, for me, the biggest takeaway was that I became much more curious, and it made me question more about what I saw, what I hear. And yeah, we still had moments like these. So yeah, thank you.
Right. Nupur, very quickly before we
Yeah.
go to Alisha, do you want to say something from the perspective of being a woman and walking? One was from the
Yeah.
societal perspective that you mentioned earlier, but do you want to
Mhm.
say something now from the perspective of you being on the walk itself?
Yeah. So there are two things. One is before starting the walk, like as I said, it's why is it different for a woman are like two reasons mainly. One is we are always concerned about the safety. Like if I have to talk, even now, if I have to think of doing this walk alone, I can't. So that is one thing, you know, for me, even if I solo travel, I have to think about my safety in point A and my safety in point B. Whereas this experience where we were walking, you know, in a group, or I am walking with men, it changes a lot of things for me. It um, it was also liberating in some way to be able to do this being a woman, because otherwise it's really difficult to think of, like really difficult thinking of doing this by myself. So that is one thing. And second is like there were so many doubts in my head before getting onto this walk, like, you know, very basic, I think, being women questions like where would I pee, or what if I don't find a toilet, what if I get my periods. There's so many things. And then I had to tell myself that, Nupur, it's okay, you will find out ways. And of course there will be women staying in the place, in the, like, you know, areas you are going, so they would be doing something, right? So you'll figure out. And it actually happened. Like it actually happened where we had to stay in a temple, and I got my periods, and there was literally no you know, constructed toilet. And then I had to literally roam around, going, finding women and asking them for a place, like a place, just a sheltered place where I can basically do yeah. So, and just another thing, so as a woman also, I observed that when we were walking, men would usually prefer talking to men, and that was just how it was. I mean, I did not question it then, but it was, I mean, and it's not like I could change it in at that moment. But then like now, I was more shy then, I think if I go on this walk again, I would be much more comfortable in initiating conversations by myself. So yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. I think that perspective on the non-availability of a toilet or having to go seek a woman also clearly talks about how it seems like our world is constructed for men, by men, and the sort. So, uh, yeah, and thanks for sharing that. I think a lot of people do have these questions and they don't get a chance to explore it. So maybe through your medium, they can listen to this and uh, have these conversations. I'll ask Alisha to share her stories next, after which we can go to question and answers. And anybody who has questions, please put them in the chat box so that we can answer all of them together once Alisha is done sharing her stories. Alisha.
Hi.
Right. So just quickly mentioning that Alisha joined the walk near Kordiala in Uttarakhand and then walked all the way to Gangotri. She's a mountaineer and she takes very a keen interest in mountains and mountain communities. And I let her take up the rest of the.
Hi everyone, my name is Alisha and I joined the Veditum journey along the River Ganga around Kordiala, which is about 20 kilometers ahead of Rishikesh. So to take on from where Nupur was, my parents were very concerned about me walking in UP and Bihar. I'm a Bihari. So they had like these obvious understandings of what Bihar could be like for people. So they're like, you are walking the mountains and you know that valley. So the valley, the Gangotri Valley, the Ganga Valley and Gangotri Valley and even Bhagirathi, that entire region was not unfamiliar to me when I got there. There is a place called Uttarakhand which organizes mountaineering courses, and I was fortunate enough to be a part of that space for 2 years consecutively. So I can share a picture of what I saw there. Here. So let's go full screen. Yeah. Now this is what 2 years apart in the, yeah. So now the first picture which you see with the snow is 2015 June, and the second picture which you see, which is without the snow, is the same date, that is 13 June 2016 June. So the conversation around climate change is real, had been happening for a really long time. We had studied it, we had seen it everywhere. But when you see changes in front of you. And like you're going to mountains often to explore areas where there is little to none human intervention, and you're trying to escape from what we understand as city life in a way. And then you get to these places and you realize, wow, what we are doing as humanity in city is actually reaching here. That means downstream, there are people who are living around the river, or people who are living even far away from the river are impacting the river. So having known Siddharth at that point in 2016, I believe that's when we first met, I was intrigued by his journey about walking back to his roots or just walking along the river. When you walk, the pace at which you see things changes drastically. A place which you would have taken, say, half an hour to go to in a car would take you probably like an entire day to walk to, like considering no traffic. And that's when I said, okay, let's get to this. And after reaching Kodyala, after a really funny journey, we start walking. First day, like a little background. I'm used to climbing. We climb. I'm no Jimmy Chin, like very basic climbing. I can carry weight on my shoulder and be a gaddi. And we're at this point that you have to walk 8 kilometers or 20 kilometers in a day. I'm like, okay, fine. It should be a cakewalk, right? So we start from Kodyala. We are walking. It starts raining, and you're walking on tar, and there is traffic, and it looks different. It's extremely different because suddenly all these places which we had been to on foot in mountains, there is tree, there is soft ground, and there is no constant pressure of a vehicle coming and hitting you. And you're getting here, and slowly you trudge around like 1 kilometer in the mountains. You can rest for a bit, but on a road that doesn't exist. You can find some spot beside the road, but it's not the same as being in the mountains. And that tells you, wait, what we assume of mountains to be an escape spot is actually somebody's area to live in. Like throughout that, they spend years and generations living in that area. They have seen that space change with development. To segue back into where before I started the walk was I was visiting friends who are rafters in Rishikesh, and everybody's drunk and having a merry time. And I tell them that, okay, I'm going to join my friends who are on this expedition along the river, in which they're walking along the river, documenting it. And then he says, like, what is up to you people who are coming from a city? Like, you'll come here for a few days, you'll document a little bit, and then you just move on. Do you think like all these people who come for expeditions to the river, to the mountains, they don't want network here? Why do you want to define your definition of what is development not to come here? Don't you think that we wish that there should be an airport here? Don't you think that there should be like wider roads for us here? So that sort of set the tonality for before, because it was right before the walk, for what I was seeking as questions as we move further. So come the end of first day, 13 kilometers down, it's raining, shoulders hurting, I'm hitting myself. Shridhar and Siddharth are used to what is happening. We're sitting in a tea stall, realizing, okay, we might have to stay here for the night. There is no space we can see that we can live in. Now we're like, okay, this is like, we have one tent. We can fit in. But this is different because when you pitch a tent beside a road, right? And that's when you realize that there are people who live there, and the way kindness works, like we can ask the gentleman here who runs this tea shop to perhaps share his space with us, and which we do. And he shares his room, which is given for his teacher, which is a space for his teacher, and all of us crash there. And then you realize, wait, hang on, like what we understand, and he doesn't take a penny for it. What we understand as transactional behavior, like if we have to do this in a bigger city, which we experience further down when we reach bigger towns along the journey, when we have to do this in a bigger city, there's a certain cost associated to every action. And as we trudged further and we walked and we saw different sites, we learned that transaction for something in the villages, in faraway areas, and the line which I remember, and it is in Hindi, is that अगर हम कभी नीचे जाएंगे तो कोई हमारी भी तो मदद करेगा. Like this little dream and aspiration is like, wow, this is such a different time. Like India in cities and villages is so different. Like the aspirations are so different. Now, when you start walking, you realize like there are other people who have walked on routes like this for a really long time. Like where were goat herders walking for all this while? Now, suddenly these goat herders, which would be walking in the mountains, were not allowed to walk in the mountains because of restriction, because of forest department or something in that tune. We suddenly were walking beside the goat herders. And then a river, which Siddharth has mentioned already, which was earlier a big river, was changing its own form because it had been dammed in certain regions. Like the multiple dams which we saw, example, the one which you can see here is, I believe, Koteshwar. And it is, it tells you that what we understand as river downstream, that there will always be certain type of fishes in it, that's going to change, because as an ecologist, you'll notice that if you've changed the landscape, you've changed the nature of river, you've already changed what constitutes the river. Now, like, this is when this picture which we see here is when the river has been dammed. Now, if you are going to hold water at a high, which is flowing in a certain direction, there is going to be backflow, which led to all this sand formation at the lower regions in right before Uttarkashi. And this led to changing the dynamic of river altogether. And because the water flow further down from Tiri was so sparse, and the water flow right above is also changing because of the multiple dams, you could see how lifestyle around the river had changed. For example, because of damming, now earlier, which would make for a deep gorge for the river to flow in, we had these chunks of land which were cut, and they were all feeding into this widened surface, like something which in which a car could drive, a sludge of a slow moving sand river. And you could see how that had affected the farmlands around these areas which would have otherwise made for like flat lands, much higher in regions, now suddenly fertile lands which would ebb and flow with water as and when monsoons came. Coming to what the question of development is, we had seen in a conversation with the gentleman at the beginning of walk, and Siddharth has already raised this, is um, when you're talking about development in certain areas, not necessarily that development is going to, like, that's the investment in that area is going in constructing certain amount of factories or even power plants is going to feed into the local region. It feed oftentimes bigger areas, and that raises this question of who is suffering for what, and like, and why is this happening. And because when I joined the walk, I had no understanding of, like, I didn't have a specific question in mind other than maybe see how the landscape is changing, how the tree and the foliage and the culture is changing, and with little to no understanding of how, you know, development and what development means to different areas, and what is the cost of development in one area another than in other, as Shridhar also points out. It brought us to this point in Uttarkashi, where an entire region which had suffered severely because of the floods which happened in 2013. It was because of a lot of construction which had taken over the river, and the bank couldn't take that weight. And this construction was primarily for tourist houses. And with that happening, and that tourist house was actually for people not living in that area, but who were coming from much lower regions. So this whole question in the beginning of what was expected of the certain area in the terms of development feeds back into this. Going to something which somebody had, like, now with all this question of development happening, there was a book which was gifted to me by a senior friend called Raj of Harsal, which was talking about how trees had at one point also, how this region had also one time fed into the development of the lower regions. For example, there was a gentleman called Frederick Wilson who had used this time, like, who had come and had a treaty with the Raj of Harsal back in 1800s to be able to sell the wood from the upper regions in the upper Gangotri Valley and sell it downstream using the river as a mode of transport. And that had led to cutting of a fair chunk of forests. So this picture which we see here is of one of those spaces where the water log, where they would check the number of logs going down. And it sets, like, this area had actually in one point, the upper Gangetic Valley had one point led to the development of, say, the Indian railways and even the Indo-Gangetic, the upper Gangetic Canal back in 1800s. And it's still been suffering at this area is still suffering to feed in the low regions, as Shridhar points out. now come a period when you keep walking. So we've reached right now much, like we are way, like right now we are closer to the to Gangotri, ahead of Sukhi Top, and we have started seeing these like marks on the tree, and there are these numbers written on them. And once we see that, we realize, hey, these trees are actually numbered to be chopped to construct roads, right? And this road widening project has been in and around, has been in discussion in that region for a very long time. And there have been discussions about how the forests which have been burdened for such a long time would also be cut, that's just the other side of the valley, which also be cut for constructing these roads. And then you're like, but for whom? Where does the wood go? Who earns out of it? And these questions, like this experience of walking in Ganga and listening to stories firsthand, I learned that this experience led to me further exploring what I understood as mountaineer in one protected space, learning, living far away from a city, actually not too far from that space in the backyard was what was the region which was feeding to construct the cities which we see today and to facilitate movement of the cities. And then I close with this image of Gangotri, and that was the last day, the morning we left. And yeah, thank you, Siddharth, for having us along. It's been like we joined at different sections of the walk. I believe, as you mentioned, 1 hour is not enough to for even me. Like if you start looking at multiple possibilities and narratives around the river, you will just be like, wow, this can go in multiple chapters in a book. And for you, somebody who's walked it for like 3,000 kilometers, watching the landscape change, cultures change, and even tackling with different states and their policies and lifestyle, walking with different people who have walked on this path, it must be quite rich. So I'm very grateful to you that you had us come along and experience this with you, bringing our own perspectives.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think there is a very rich telling of a cultural, economical history of the space, of the geography, and something that is uh, worthy of discussion as we move ahead. I'll ask all the speakers to switch on their video and be available. That's Shridhar, Nupur, Ankit. Okay, superb. All right. Yeah, I just want to like uh, just say this again, which all of us have said in different ways. Two things about walking. I think the idea of the river and the river walk is there, but for all of us, and not just those here, those not on this call, those who walked in other places, it's very evident that this act of walking and this act of pausing, the idea of introducing a pause, has by default raised very crucial questions in all our minds. And those crucial questions have to do with society at large, as well as our personal lives. So I think that pause that is not awarded to us otherwise in this very fast-paced society is something that something as simple as walking, and which became evident and which worked out for all of us. And the other thing is that I just wanted to mention about walking was it was a very easy medium and is a very easy medium to for anybody who's practicing something so simple and being a bit observant, that it kickstarts, or if these ideas are not latently already present, it gives rise to a lot of alternative or counterculture ideas, which I think are very important to get us to a space which is more um, inclusive. I'll just quickly take questions. We've got a few questions, I think 6 of them. First question is the team working on proposing nature-based solutions for river basin management? This is from Guru. Not really. I wouldn't make that claim, because for us, at least the initiative has been to understand as of now, and which is what we're trying to do. We're trying to ask questions and also amplify the voices of those who live alongside rivers. So I would say that question, the answer is no. But yes, we would definitely like to move towards that. Second question is, in communities' perspective, what are the major reasons behind the loss of native fish species? Do any of you want to answer that question, or should I answer that? Uh,
I think you can go ahead.
okay. Okay. So in communities POV, I think there's two sort of narratives that run parallelly. One narrative is a simple blame game, where the blame is that the authorities in collaboration with certain actors are allowing certain kind of industrial fishing to happen, which is resulting in a loss of fish. Or also the blame game of saying that those who are not traditionally fishing communities are now fishing in the river, which has led to a loss in fish species. Whereas there are some communities which have had interactions with others who have introduced ideas of why this might actually be happening. Communities that are more aware, where civil society organizations have interacted. So they have a slightly different perspective, but the idea of overfishing is definitely there. And pollution as a concept which is killing fishes is something that I at least saw people telling me in Bengal, in Jharkhand, in Bihar, and in Uttar Pradesh. And that's definitely something that spans across the length of the river.
May I
Professor
add a point
Gina
to
Mohan.
that?
Yes, please.
So, like, even in areas which have been dammed, the whole nature of a river flow changes the kind of fish which would grow in it. So if you're changing the river flow, like for example, salmon which would survive against the current of the fish would not survive in a dam. And when you have started damming rivers, there've been there's some papers on this. Once you've started damming the rivers, and they had started introducing different types of fish in Tiri, from what I recall. That has already changed the ecosystem of and also the predator prey dynamics and food chain within that ecosystem. So the kind of, even like when we were in and around Tiri, we learned that dengue was not a problem in that area ever, because water flowed. People could drink water right off the river because the water flowed. Because of the stagnancy of water, the fish species had changed, but it also changed the kind of animals which were breeding, or even insects which were breeding there. And that means the food chain had changed. So it's slightly different for the question which was asked, which is about the fishing communities. Not answering that, but that has actually changed the kind of fish which is growing there. We can see the impact maybe like 10 years from now, which will be documented and like written about. There are some papers about this which are already available online.
Right. If you can send those papers to me, I'll send it as the resource which I send after every webinar to all participants. So I can do that. Next question I've also put in the chat box from Vaishnavi, which asks, what variations were discovered to the river edges along the walk? Were floodplains demarcated? What about riparian vegetation? Okay, I'll take that question. And I think this is a very wide question. I'm not sure if I can answer very quickly. But to your second part of the question, were floodplains demarcated? Not always. In a lot of places, floodplains have been encroached. In some cases, local communities, riparian communities, especially those who do not own land, use floodplains for riverbed farming. What's called
Badi.
what is called so many different names. It's called Badi in the regions on the Ganga, and that is one use of the floodplain that's happened. There's a lot of places in the upper reaches between Farrukhabad and Bijnor, where there's extreme amounts of soil erosion happening. Lots of concrete cones have been placed there to arrest the land loss that's happening. And the variations are plenty, right from where we started on an island in West Bengal, right up to the mountains. So I think I can answer that question directly to you, Vaishnavi, on email if you can send that to me, or I can send it to everyone after the call. And I think this deserves a longer time period to be answered. But yes, there is variety, but it's not really what we would expect out of a rich river ecosystem. Is definitely limited by anthropogenic interventions. Next question from Girija, who asks, what was your experience slash knowledge related to climate change in your long walk along River Ganga? Do any of you want to answer? Alisha, do you want to answer that question from your experience?
Oh, I joined at the later end of the walk, and so I will speak only from the mountain regions. So, like, I'll give examples of what people told us, and one of that which stays very cutely with me is the story of apple growing. So, apples grow when they sleep under the blanket of snow. There is no snow, apples don't grow. And the upper Himalayan regions and upper Gangotri Valley has a variety of really good apples, one of the best I've had. And when we were in Sukhi Top, there is a gentleman there who has been documenting the levels of snow every year for past 10 years. I mean, if you think scientists are only made in labs, I believe that is not the case, because you have somebody documenting this in their own space, at their own, in their own way of like recurring, like, okay, this year there has been 10 meters of snow on this date, on this year, on this date, this much. And this is just a sense of observation. Now, over the past few years, at least in 2015, the 2017, when we were walking, and this is spring, there was very little snowfall which had happened that year. And the year even after, like the year before that as well, because the picture which we can see, and that had affected the water channels which had dried, and also the level of snow had changed the way the way fruits were growing. So that was one palpable effect of climate change upon the communities living there. And another thing which is worth noting in this area is the trees. So once, when going back to the story of Frederick Wilson, once those trees were chopped down, a lot of pines were grown in that area. And once the pines were grown, that led to, and pines are not indigenous, and they're not a native species in that region. So, and this, we are talking about sheer pine here. And when they started growing, that started sucking a fair chunk of water from the ground, parching the aquifer in a way, and also not holding on to any water which comes in the monsoon. And because it's such a dry medium, that also started leading to a lot of forest fires. And forest fires is something which we didn't experience firsthand while we were there, but you know, if we read of it often enough, whenever we are reading about it. I think in 2 points. Is there something else somebody else would like to add to this?
The only thing that I remember is that the same Mohanji in Sukhi Talk, he spoke about raindrops not being as, like individual drops of rain were not really that thick anymore. Like that's how he described it. And I thought that was very interesting. Like he said that the rain is getting thinner. And effectively, even if it rains the same amount, the amount of water that comes in that time is getting less, which I think was very, very interesting. Like I had never thought about rain in terms of the size of the raindrop. Yeah, Siddharth, I think you can take the next one. Oh, I think Siddharth is off. Okay, then maybe we can just take the next question if we can. Was there any support for dams barrages, particularly downstream and not in Uttarakhand, amongst the villagers? Was there any model of a barrage of a dam that you found along the way that could balance the agrarian drinking water needs of villagers while not adversely affecting the river? So the first part I can answer, at least in Uttarakhand, because I don't know about downstream. I know a little bit. So essentially in Uttarakhand, if you look at Tehri, the primary argument for the dam is an idea of nationalism, because they've been sold the dam on the basis of the idea that you're serving the country. And what is interesting is the electricity that they create in Tehri doesn't go to Uttarakhand, because it's practically impossible to decimate the electricity at the same place that you created it. So actually all the electricity goes to UP, goes to Meerut first, and then from Meerut is distributed to either Delhi or UP. But they have lost, a lot of people have been displaced and a lot of things have been lost. But the only compensation that they have is the idea that they have done it for the nation, which I think is an interesting way of, and dams have constantly been sold on this idea of it being something that would benefit for the larger good. It's something that even if you have to deal with a little bit of inconvenience, I think you can. And that's a recurring narrative that we found, at least in Uttarakhand. Siddharth can deal with it from down the rivers. That we are dealing with the question, was there any support for dams barrages among the villages? And a model of a barrage or a dam that you found which could balance agrarian water needs of the villagers while not adversely affecting them.
Right. I think at least in the case of the mainstream of the Ganga, there is no such example, especially because all of the interventions are extremely large scale with large scale repercussions. Of course, there are very small sections of people, including in Uttarakhand and downstream, who, when they get contractual jobs, are okay with the kind of interventions. But largely, it's not a win-win situation, especially for the people who live in those areas. I mean, I just go geographically away from the Ganga for a bit and talk about how on the Kosi, if you look at the Kosi is one of the most infamous examples of flooding in India, and it's also called the Sorrow of Bihar. From the time when Kosi's embankments have been doubled as a solution to, say, flood control, the area which is being flooded has become 3 times. And these kind of interventions, which while on paper look very attractive, and are these technocratic solutions are very attractive to investors and make for good headlines. Eventually, at least in my experience from all the barrages and dams that I've seen, there isn't a lot of this um, positive or balanced way of having a barrage or a dam that I have come across. So yeah, I hope that answers that question. Should we move to the next question?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to add a bit for the previous question from Girija about climate change. I think it's quite evident for spaces not in Uttarakhand also, because from the Ganga walk and the walk along other rivers, it's been pretty clear that traditional practices, even those who've tried to stick to it, people are not able to stick to those kinds of predictions that were reliant on an understanding of repetition, cyclical nature of seasons anymore. And that's visible everywhere. And especially in the downstream regions near the delta, the ingression of seawater has definitely started affecting people. And the very recent case of Cyclone Amphan just like puts the nail on the head, hits the nail on the head, that effect of climate change is coming up again through a single period study. It's very difficult to comment on climate change, so I won't do that. But we'll have to look at all these experiences as a spread over time to really answer that question. Quickly going to the next question, which is from Paul. He's, I think, left the chat, but I'll still answer the question. So Paul asked, would it be different about the experience, not just physically, but psychologically, even aesthetically or narratively, between walking up a river versus down a river? Did you think about this when devising the journey? Wow, that's quite a
question.
Question.
You have to go down the river to actually answer that.
That's true. I think that's one definite way to get that answer, like practically get that answer. But I think I was being a bit romantic when naming the project and deciding that I want to move upstream, that I want to go against the flow, and there's no hiding of that fact that I was definitely being very romantic with my with the wordplay in naming the project. But I do think that if this was done in a reverse manner, where it goes from source to sea, it definitely changes a lot of things, which I have seen when others have undertaken similar journeys. One out of the many thoughts that come to my mind is the fact that because the river is not just its main stem, it is all its tributary, it is all of its catchment. And when you move downstream, it has a psychological effect on you when you start to see the river's health change, especially when it has a larger capacity to cleanse itself. When you see the river expand in its form, especially a river like Ganga, I think even when you are presented with an alternative picture about the river, you start to think of it within that framework of how the river has evolved. Of course, if you're taking scientific data, then this will completely topple in its head, given pollution load increases as you go further downstream. But visually, at least, since we're talking about aesthetics and psychology, I think it will have a great effect because the river just keeps expanding, and the kind of feeling that you have on ascending a mountain and reaching a river source, I think it would just flip on its head, but have a similar ascending feeling when you see the river enlarged to such a huge volume, meet the ocean. So I guess it's just two parallel, not two crisscross lines with narratives that meet somewhere in the middle, and just the highs are still there and the lows are still there. So I hope that answers that question. One last question we have from Viraj, and I think Gopal had asked the question. Uh, I've I had disconnected from the call. So Gopal, can you please put your question again if you're still there, or anybody can copy his question.
I'll do that.
Okay. We'll just take this question from Viraj. Wow. For the walk, you must have definitely observed casteism. What was your take as a group on it? The question is especially in cases where people who were kind and helpful to you along the walk, but still behaved casteist. How do you deal with such situations? Some of you should answer that question. I will.
Oh, it's very, very interesting. Oh, it's very, very interesting because you have to understand that especially in Uttarakhand, Uttarakhand is more than 50%, 52% upper caste. It recently the High Court ruled out reservation in the 52% upper caste state. So you understand the extent of casteism that and in Uttarakhand they still practice untouchability. So it's quite interesting that Devbhumi, as it is called, has a very rigid caste system. Obviously, that says a lot. But I think that what was very, very interesting is most of the contractors, most of the people who run the show, as obvious, all of them were upper caste. All of them were constantly, I think, that we met, even if you say Gangotri and the people who were taking care of the main shrine there or anywhere that we met, constantly there is a definite idea of casteism there. The other thing that I was very interested was the fact that this question is interesting, that who are kind and helpful to you along the walk but still behaved casteist. You can't really define that idea that a person who's casteist necessarily is bad. The idea of being casteist is more about conditioning rather than a choice that you're making for yourself. So it's the idea, the morality of it is very, very interesting. For us, constantly from a certain kind of education, we look at casteism as something which is bad, and obviously in a more objective sense it is, but it is something that we have been made aware of gradually and have taken an intellectual decision to be against. For people who have never really thought about it, it's a way of life that it's very difficult to get over that conditioning. So that something is definitely there. I don't remember particularly having I don't think there was any segregation. There must be segregation necessarily in a village between like caste aisa, but I don't remember if there was something like, for example, when we were walking the Ken, there are smaller villages near bigger villages which were completely for Dalits, which did not have electricity, and they basically worked on the upper caste people's lands. I don't remember encountering any, or maybe I did not notice. Do any of you notice anything like that?
Any of you want to add anything? Then I'll add some.
Yeah. So I remember, I think the way question is asked in itself answers that, of course, we especially didn't face any discrimination, but as Shridhar said, that it's more about mindset and the way conditioning has been done. I remember at most of the places where we stopped, of course, people were excited and happy to welcome us, but they were always keen on knowing our last name or the second name. And I can remember Siddharth struggling with not telling it or asking why it is important to know it. but I can remember that they were always keen on knowing our last name.
Right. Alisha, Nupur, do you want to add anything?
I remember one, and this is not something which we experienced firsthand, but when we were in, because we were there at the time of the festivities, and this is eighth day, and then there is this puja which is going to happen in Sukhi Top, and there was still a concept of who would play the drums to invite everyone, and he would not go in. So the man who plays the drum for the entire village to come together does not enter the shrine. And I was like, wow, this still, like, I've read about it in books. And in cities, there's such strong disconnect, you don't see where things are home. And I was like, wow, this is still happening. So that is one instance I remember. Other places, like, there was also in the temple which we stayed in right after Uttarkashi. But I don't remember the exact narrative there. There was an old lady who was living by herself.
Right.
And she mentioned something, but I believe Nupur would recall because she had a long conversation with that lady.
I actually
Seems
don't
from her
remember
expression right now.
yeah, I don't remember that old lady actually, but I remember the temple. And
Right.
in fact, at that temple also we like saw something similar to that Sukhi Top, where a lady is taken over by a spirit, and then she sort of leads the whole puja. And but I just observed how different people were standing at different places. I mean, that temple, how close you would go to the pujari, for example, or from what distance they were taking the prasad. I mean, that's very, I think, usual to see.
There's a very interesting sorry,
I'm done.
There's a very interesting correlation that I feel between, like, because we were visibly from a different class. So I think that the idea of caste did not play that strongly with us, or that it would play with somebody else who they would not associate from being either foreign, because a lot of people, as somebody said, would talk to us in English because they would think that we are from London. And this entire idea of caste did not play a major role, maybe because of the fact that we were outsiders and we stayed for such a small time that we did not have that effect on us particularly.
I just want to add that since the idea of caste has been mentioned, the idea of gender has been mentioned, there is one statement that had been the most, second most. First was what is my caste or what is my surname, was the most asked question in 6 months to me. The second most asked question to me, or second most said statement that I'd heard to me, was, are you a Pakistani, are you a terrorist? And that is representative of the same system that we're discussing, which discriminates on the basis of identity. And I think while we are still open on discussing about caste, this whole discussion about anti-minority mindsets is still not present, which needs to be present and which needs to be challenged. One thing that I am hoping that we can overcome in the future is that we have enough representation through Veditum's work, where a question like this about casteism can be answered by someone who's at the receiving end of it, whereas most of us here are, all of us are upper caste. So our answers, while valid in a anecdotal manner, I think from a lived experience of being oppressed, someone who is from a certain group of society will be able to answer it. In our case, we're talking about someone who's from a supposed lower caste. So that's something that we're trying to work towards.
I'll add one point, talking about minority. In the entire walk, only one shop, and this can be bad sampling as well, which was run by a Muslim in the entire journey, and that was a shop short of Uttarkashi.
And this is in Uttarakhand, definitely. I mean, this is the last 300 kilometers.
In Uttarakhand.
Representation elsewhere. So I just wanted to add that
context. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Quickly, if we have Gopal's question was about
what the state of STP is along the various stages of the river.
So this is a constantly evolving discussion about STPs. The Namami Gange program will definitely give you different kinds of answers. But I will not make any controversial comments here. But it's very interesting how what the focus is on. So I just mentioned something very interesting regarding sewage treatment plants in Banaras. Even today, after our prime minister being from that constituency, after so much media attention being there, most of the rivers, in fact, the rivers Varuna and Asi, behind which Varanasi is named, still flow like very uh, dirty rivers, completely polluted. And Intac as an organization had taken a program, pilot project, where they actually ended up showing good results using low cost, low tech solutions, and proposed that as a solution to the government to be done. And unfortunately, that's not happened. It's not played out. That simple low tech solution, which was creating substantial change, was not accepted as a solution. I don't know why. I think that's a question that needs to be asked. And I will put the information about this experiment that Intac had done, a very tangible experiment, on the reading resource, which I will send once I send the recording of this video as well. So I think this whole concept of STPs, historically we've had very bad performance and efficiency, even if capacity is there. And now we're trying to build capacity, but our sewage network is not enough to tap into all the sewage that is there. Two questions.
I think the last
I think
2 questions. Artika
yeah,
and
one from
Shreyasi.
Artika and one is from Shreyasi. I'll take the one from Shreyasi first. Do you think resilience strategies are helping the survival of vulnerable communities or disconnecting them gradually from traditional livelihoods? I asked her to explain a bit more about what resilience strategy she's mentioning. She sent me a paragraph. I'll just take a part of what she's mentioned about the distance between traditional livelihoods and first world urbanism. And she's saying this in the context of the East Kolkata wetlands, where livelihoods are still connected to this whole ecosystem. So from my experience, all the technocratic solutions tend to take us away from these traditional livelihoods and push us towards first world urbanism, whereas not including major actors who are part of this ecosystem, essential actors in this ecosystem, not making them part of this solution. For example, in Banaras also, where you have an extremely huge community of boatmen, we are in a process of introducing mechanized and motor boats, luxury boats. Where is the inclusion is the question. And I think this idea of resilience strategies going away from traditional livelihoods towards first world urbanism is quite true. And it applies in multiple places. But at the same time, there are organizations like WWF who, through their Ganga Mitra Mandali program, where they have created these communities along the river who are helping conserve gharial hatcheries and protect dolphin habitat, is a fabulous initiative, which I was lucky to visit and see while I was on the walk. So it's both, but I think depending upon what kind of organization is arranging the intervention, we are seeing the results accordingly. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, Shreyashi. I'll just take the last question from Artika and then leave it for you guys to add comments if you want, and then we'll close the session. Artika asks, what other similar projects is Veditum going to come up with in future? Also would like to know how to volunteer participate in the same. Okay, couple of things that I'll quickly mention. One, that as mentioned earlier, Veditum has now instituted a fellowship program. So we're constantly opening applications for people to join river walks, go on these walks, create documentation, and share it with a larger group of people. I think we have Mohit on the chat, who was one of the fellows from our Betwa fellowship, who has done fabulous documentation. Apart from the Moving Upstream fellowship program, we are working on a couple of environmental monitoring projects, for which we're both looking for funds and for technical support. So, but that is a project that requires some kind of understanding of machine learning and artificial intelligence. So if that's something that somebody is interested in, they can write to me. One other project that we have going on for a long term is the City Water Works project, where we invite people to go and look at the river or the water sources within their city to understand where water comes from, how is it used, and where does it eventually go. This exercise has happened in multiple cities: Ahmedabad, Bombay, Chennai. I'm planning to start this soon in Calcutta as well. So those are things that are coming up. And lastly, based on the walk that we did along the Ganga, which is what the webinar is based on, we've also made a film. And the film is based on the film was made possible because of a crowdfunding campaign. So anybody who's interested in, say, supporting the work that we're doing, please take a look at the crowdfunding campaign link. If you can contribute, if you can share it with others, I will send the campaign link out to everyone in the email, but I'm also putting the campaign link in the chat box, so that if you are interested to contribute, or if you're interested in sharing it with others, please do. That will be a big help, because crowdfunding is really a big task in itself, along with all the filmmaking work that we're doing. So yeah, any final comments from any of you before we close the session?
I'll add about the food practices again, Uttarakhand, because I worked like joined at the later end of the journey, and that was when we were walking. It was very hard for us to find local food. That is madua, not madua. Madua is Jharkhandi. Wait, what is it called?
Buckwheat, you're saying?
Buckwheat भी वहाँ का एक भटकी दाल होती है, and there are these different types of grains and different types of dals they have there, which we couldn't find very easily. And it was funny because that is what people grew on in this region. And as we spoke to a lot of people, and also even just finding fresh local food was a task, because when we were going from point A to point B, we would end up having oftentimes, and this is one of my favorite memories of the walk, is cream roll and chai. And we had once visited a cream roll factory, and we saw like where we eat the cream rolls, where they come from, how they are made. So if you go back to the journey of trying to find local food, suddenly it's all gone. And why is it gone? Is perhaps people have stopped farming. Why have they stopped farming? And answering the question about climate change is also, and this sort of feeds into climate change, not directly but indirectly, is that if you change what food which you're growing around, that also talks about the inability of the crop to grow, perhaps, or the loss of practice because of certain concessions made by the central government to support food supply much upper in the valley. So as the livelihoods in this region changed with say increasing tourism, or because this route is very tourist friendly, and or increasing people moving downstream and not living back in the villages, so there are a lot of coastal villages in these areas, you realize like the crops which were available otherwise to eat readily, they didn't grow either. So
I think I want to add to that what Alisha is saying is that so what actually, from what I understand, is that it's not that they were not growing it, they were not growing it to sell it. Like for example, this when we were trying to look for local food that you grow and make there, a lot of the arguments that we heard was that, oh, ye to hum khate hain, this is what we eat, this is not what we give to people who come from outside. Because for them, this entire narrative of like this is more refined food that you offer to people who are from outside, who are obviously much more like fancier than you are, and this is food that we have in our house, and because we are from a certain place and a certain kind of social background, we should not be sharing this food with other people. This is a certain kind of this is more reflective of, I think, not just the inability to grow a certain kind of crop, but the a combination of market forces will tell them that, oh, people might not buy this if we grow it because they don't eat this. And the other thing is that a certain kind of crop is associated with a certain kind of food habit practiced by a certain kind of community, and hence the inherent value of that food is determined to be substandard. And it's very interesting because now you'll see it often that organic foods will have the same grains at a much higher price, because they're marketed to a different kind of audience and a different kind of market. And but again, it's all about, I think, a value, a system of values that we have kind of, imposed or conditioned people to associate with, which I think is a larger problem here.
Right. I think post Green Revolution, the two combination factors of focus on paddy and wheat, along with the government's mechanism of procuring certain kinds of produce, which gives surety of income to farmers, is what is also driving them to grow certain kinds of food. And that is really important to understand, that market forces really dictate this behavior beyond a certain ability also. I mean, if market in this case would buy the kind of produce that we're talking about in terms of traditional food grain, farmers would grow it. I mean, I don't think they will have any problem in growing it. It's just the market demand that is, and that market demand is fed by a lot of different things, big industrial complexes there, which defines what is going to be pushed. But we'll not go into that. So let's pause it here. Thank you all for your time, sharing your stories, for being patient while I gave long answers. And thank you everyone for joining the chat. Just one last thing, you can subscribe for newsletters on our website, or if you prefer more mobile updates, we send out bi-weekly or monthly updates on WhatsApp as well. My phone number is in the chat box. If you want to be part of that sort of mailing list on WhatsApp, then just send me a message from your number saying that you want to be on the mailing list or the WhatsApp broadcast list. And I promise not to spam you with updates. Closest in a span of 2 weeks or in a span of month will I send out a message on WhatsApp on that broadcast list. So yeah, I hope all your questions were answered. For more questions, you can just send an email. And yeah, all right. Thanks everyone for joining. We close the session for today. Thank you.
Thank you.